I now welcome in CBS Sports senior fantasy writer Jamey Eisenberg, as we saw just as many surprise performances as, I'd like to say, maybe lackluster outings to open the first week of fantasy performances. And although I know sometimes I have to take a step back and realize it is just the first week of the season, perhaps some offenses might have raised maybe some concerns for fantasy managers. Giants, Browns, Panthers, Falcons, maybe among a few of those teams where offenses weren't really what we'd expect. But let's say you do have some of those players on your roster from these offenses that maybe, I think a good way to say, sleptwalked into week one. Jamey, how would you approach them just heading into week two?
Well, I think you should cut all of those players. They're never going to be good. They're all going to stink. Week one is the best indication of the season. No, obviously, you want to have a little patience. You want to try and just take a little bit of a step back and say, okay, why were these players bad? How did these players underperform? Is it going to be something that is going to be the case moving forward? And in the case of some of these teams, that's probably going to be what happens. Carolina was bad last year with Bryce Young. We thought maybe Dave Canales would come in and change things. And it wasn't the case against New Orleans, but that's still a very good defense on the road. We'll talk about some of the rookie quarterbacks, how they performed in terms of Caleb Williams, for example. And I think he will get better because he was facing a really good defense for the Titans. So there are going to be players clearly that are busts. That's just the nature of the NFL. But week one is not the indication. Look, we're going to get better performances from these rookie wide receivers. We're going to see hopefully some better offensive line play. You saw the preseason, not a lot of starters played, so there's going to be some growing pains as we get into the season. Some teams came out on fire, like the Saints, for example, and some teams are just going to have a little bit of a sluggish start. So if you did lose in week one, guess what? You could still make the fantasy playoffs. Your season's not over.
Jamey Eisenberg, not only a fantasy expert, but also, I think, my real-life therapist, telling me to practice patience in all areas of my life. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about those young guns, the rookie quarterbacks making their debuts on Sunday. Jayden Daniels might have not found the end zone through the air, but did at least twice with his legs. Bo Nix, he had 2 picks, but had a rushing tutty. And maybe not the most explosive outing many probably anticipated from Caleb Williams. But just looking at these 3 young QBs, who would you say is the better option moving forward? Where we stand, week one, not panicking just yet.
Jayden Daniels was always my favorite fantasy quarterback coming into the season. And you look at what he did today and that sort of, enhanced that because of his rushing ability. 88 yards on the ground, got the 2 rushing touchdowns. That's his game. And he's going to continue to improve as a passer, but he gives you those bonus yards as a runner. And I think they're going to allow him to do that, on a week-to-week basis. I said that he has a chance to lead all quarterbacks in rushing yards, and he's off to a great start chasing Lamar Jackson right now, but you see the upside from a fantasy perspective. For Williams, I was a little bit concerned this week, mostly because I don't think people gave the Titans offseason enough due for what they did for their defense. L'Jarius Sneed, Awuzie, 2 corners that they brought in. We know Sneed was one of the best in the NFL last year, and Awuzie is no slouch. So those are 2 guys that were going to improve the secondary. And then Quandre Diggs on the back end of that, plus what they have in the middle of that defensive line. So I knew it was going to be a little bit tough for Caleb Williams. I didn't expect him to struggle like this. And so if you need to move on from him in a redraft league, meaning in a league where you're not keeping him long term, and Baker Mayfield's on the waiver wire, I could see somebody doing that just because Baker right now is hot coming off last year, gets off to a great start, good matchup going into week 2 against Detroit. So that's an easy switch if you need to make a move. Bo Nix was never anybody I think you looked at and said, okay, he's going to be a starter in a 1-quarterback league. But you see there is some signs of potential. Obviously, this offense is limited from a receiver standpoint. So in 2-quarterback super flex leagues, I hope he was drafted really more as a backup. But there will be some weeks where he gets better. I trust Sean Payton as much as anything. So that's really, I think, where you look at if you're going to buy into Bo Nix. So really, it's Jayden Daniels, must-start guy. Caleb Williams, someone stashed on your bench. Bo Nix, don't worry about him if you have him in 2-quarterback or Superflex league.
All right, Jamey, I got to talk from the rookies, and we got to talk about some of those vets. I think we might have seen some of those young guys have a better outing than what we saw out of guys like Kirk Cousins and Deshaun Watson. I just want to get your panic meter for these 2 throughout the season. Worth keeping them in starting spots if we have them there right now moving forward.
Yeah, it's really so much, about the receivers on their respective teams, because I don't think a lot of people, again, in 1-quarterback leagues are looking at them as starters. So Superflex, 2-quarterback leagues, you just understand that there are going to be some, messy games like this. And for Watson, you could chalk it up to both of his tackles were missing against a really good Cowboys defense. I thought he would look a little bit better than this, but this was, clearly a disappointing performance. And you wonder still how much of that shoulder injury is bothering. Remember, a couple weeks ago, he had to miss practice due to some shoulder soreness. So hopefully he'll be 100%. For Cousins, this was disappointing, and maybe that just was knocked the rust off after not playing following the Achilles injury. So you hope there'll be better days. again, played a very tough defense of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I don't think anybody should say, okay, Drake London's going to stink. Kyle Pitts, even though he scored a touchdown, not a huge game, he's going to struggle. And the same thing for the Browns with Amari Cooper. Hopefully David Njoku is okay. Jerry Jeudy did score a touchdown. So these guys will have better days. Again, Browns get healthy on the offensive line. Cousins gets an easier opponent now that he played a game following the Achilles injury, but this was a very disappointing start and might be a sign of what could happen Monday night for Aaron Rodgers, another older quarterback coming off a significant injury. We'll see how that plays into him against the 49ers.
Okay, well, from maybe some performances that weren't as great to maybe some that kind of took us by surprise, I think some questions were maybe answered in the backfield for a few clubs. Personally, I didn't know what to make of the Tony Pollard situation in Tennessee, Zach Moss in Cincy, but just considering some of these teams with ball carrier concerns heading into the season, do you think the type of production that maybe we saw on Sunday for guys like Moss, Pollard, Najee Harris in Pittsburgh, Brian Robinson in Washington, do you think maybe that can hold as the season progresses?
I do, and these were, situations that we just didn't have answers to going into the season. Now, I'll go quick point by point. For Cincinnati, Zach Moss was expected to be the leader going into the season. He has a very lengthy injury track record going back to his college days at Utah. So if he does not hold up, then Chase Brown will come into play. But they're both going to share touches, as we saw today. Clearly a disappointing performance across the board for the Bengals. But Zach Moss did find the end zone. So for now, he's the best option there. When you go to Tennessee, Tony Pollard in their last preseason performance separated himself a little bit from Tyjae Spears, and I think did so a little bit more today. But the playing time was almost still an even split. So don't panic on Tyjae Spears, but Tony Pollard now works himself into the number 2 running back conversation because he was really the only bright spot for this Titans offense. In Pittsburgh, I wonder just how much Jaylen Warren's hamstring injury that was, plaguing him at the end of training camp is really the issue here. They did use Cordero Patterson a little bit more than him, but Jaylen Warren has too much upside, too much potential for the Steelers not to use him, especially in an Arthur Smith offense. But Najee Harris, again, the guy that you want to target going into week 2, and hopefully he continues to get this type of work because even though the production was clearly in his favor and the touches were in his favor, he only played less than 60% of the snaps. So they're still going to use another guy there. And then for Washington, Brian Robinson was always my favorite guy. We really didn't see Austin Eckler come into play until the game was out of reach late in the fourth quarter. So Robinson getting work in the passing game, getting the short yardage touchdown. He did lose 2 rushing touchdowns, as you noted, to Jayden Daniels, but there's still an opportunity for him to get those opportunities. So he is the safest of the bunch, in my opinion. But this is still going to be, all these backfields are still going to have some crowded situations moving forward.
You talk about crowded situations, but you're saying Brian Robinson, maybe one of your favorite out of the bunch. Considering that we didn't really see Austin Eckler until later on when the game was out of reach, do you foresee maybe this being how Washington takes things going forward?
Absolutely. Austin Eckler is 29 years old. He's coming off a disappointing season with the Chargers. Now, he does have some things in his favor. He's going to be still an electric pass catcher. But that's not something I think that we'll see from Jayden Daniels because when he's in trouble, he's not going to look for his running backs like an older, non-mobile quarterback. He's going to look to take off and run, and that's understandable given his game and the upside of what he brings to the table. So Eckler was never somebody that I thought should be drafted as a starting fantasy option. But A, he's an injury away to Brian Robinson to maybe getting back in the fold and the love and good graces of fantasy managers. But he talked about this. He said his role is going to be reduced. He's going to be used how he was early in his career when he was sharing with Melvin Gordon. So Austin Eckler's role is just going to be more of a change of pace, third down type of guy. So keep him on your bench for now, but don't plan on starting him anytime soon.
Yeah, and I also, one of those other offenses that I had questions about was the Chargers, but I think we saw J.K. Dobbins kind of put me to silence after his performance today. But quite a few young guys with high expectations coming in, and I'm going back to some rookies, but maybe didn't have the night that we thought they would have in week 1. Marvin Harrison out with the Cardinals, just 1 reception for 4 yards. Maybe a little bit of a better outing for Malik Nabers, though, but 5 receptions for 66 yards. No touchdowns for either. But do you think maybe we need to panic about either, or do you think as time progresses, we'll see them getting more involved in the offense?
Yeah, I think these guys just have to understand that the expectations put on them based on where they were drafted was going to warrant a lot of attention from opposing defenses. So you saw Harrison getting that from the Bills, and they spoke about this after the game, that they knew that they were going to, try and bracket coverage him and, put 2 guys on him, and that was the case. He was wide open for what could have been the game-winning touchdown. Kyler Murray just didn't see him. Had he caught that or got the ball thrown to him, we may not have the same concerns. For Nabers, we knew this was going to be a bad offense. We knew Daniel Jones was going to struggle. But we thought, okay, the target's going to be there and maybe some garbage time production. Now, they didn't get a lot of attention in the fourth quarter when they were trailing big, but I do think that's something that will come down the road, especially if the Giants make a quarterback change and maybe we get Drew Lock under center as opposed to Daniel Jones. But when we were telling people to draft these guys, it wasn't because they're going to dominate week 1. You're gonna get the theme again. It wasn't because they were going to win you your week in week one. It's because they're going to win you your season. And so don't panic on poor performance for them, for any of these other players that you had high expectations for. If it's 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, then you hit the panic button. But I think Marvin Harrison's best days are certainly in front of him. Same for Malik Nabers. 5 for 66 wasn't an awful day, but better days are ahead for both of these guys.
What does the saying go? This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. That's kind
100%.
of what the route that you're telling us to take. I'll make sure to heed that same advice for myself. Jamey Eisenberg, as always, we appreciate you stopping by for the insight.
Thank you.
And if you want more of that insight from Jamey and you want to dominate your league, well, you're going to want to dial into the Fantasy Football Today podcast. Jamey's joined by Adam Azer, Dave Richard, and Heath Cummings with insight on starter sit-it bites, waiver wire pickups, trade candidates, and so much more. It is the only podcast you will need to win your league. Download and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.